Hi guys. Today I'm going to briefly cover some main points that you need to know about Japan during our time period, which is 600 to 1450. During the post-classical era at this time, Japan's isolation was interrupted by China's emergence as a global power, which we talked about previously in class when we compared and contrasted different dynasties in China. So China didn't actually invade Japan during this time, but they did have a presence in Korea, which really made the Japanese government pretty nervous. Under Prince Shotoku Taishi of the dominant Yamato region, Japan really responded to China's great influence by attempting to kind of implement some of the practices that the Chinese were known for. So, for example, the prince at this time, he wrote a new constitution. And in that constitution, it consolidated power for all of Japan into one ruler. So it was trying to kind of take some power away from the aristocracy. He argued for a centralized government with a merit-based system of selecting bureaucrats, which sounds somewhat similar to the civil service exam, but not exactly. They did not totally take on the civil service exam. He hired skilled Chinese laborers to come to Japan to share their knowledge in different crafts and construction. The court sent Japanese nobility to China to study Chinese culture. They also promoted Buddhism and Confucianism as religions and supplements to Japan's traditional religion, which is a Shinto religion. They introduced woodblock printing and some other arts and crafts to Japan as well. And after Shotoku's death, his successor continued to enact those reforms. One of the goals was to increase efficiency within the bureaucracy itself. Another one was to continue to take control of society from the aristocracy. So, what's important about this is that they had new laws that put all the farmland under government ownership, which meant that all taxes would be paid directly to the central government. And so those taxes weren't paid to the nobility. This was a huge problem with the nobility, a major blow to the power of the feudal lords, and really a big step towards creating this powerful central government. But eventually the power of the aristocracy was just too strong. And so Japan moved kind of into this period of political decentralization during the Heian period. So the government had instituted an equal field system, which was really similar to China's, but the nobility really restricted that from being successful. So it eventually failed. The merit-based bureaucracy actually served to strengthen the nobility because they didn't implement the true civil service examination. And so the civil service examination that they had in Japan wasn't open to all social classes. It was just open to the nobility. And so therefore they were able to kind of maintain control. So although leaders of the Heian Japan really failed to consolidate government power, the cultural achievements during this time are really notable. Literature just flourished during this period. Most notably, well, you guys may have heard of the Pillow Book. It was made into a American movie. Also, there is the Tale of Genji, which was written by a woman, which is of note. It focuses on the psychological development of one main character, the way that we see modern stories do. And so because of this focus, it's often cited actually as the world's first novel, which I think is really quite interesting. So during this period, you do see some cultural borrowing. So you see some Chinese writing, you see Chinese artistic styles, you see Buddhism in the form of Zen, so a slightly different form of Buddhism, but again, not the exact same Chinese civil service system. Here's some images of the Heian court dress that you would see from beautiful art at the time. There's an image of the Pillow Book, which is essentially a diary. Here's some more images. And here's the Tale of Genji, again noted as the first novel as well. And this is the woman that wrote it. So she was really well known at the time and quite famous, and of note, of course, being a woman to write this major first novel. So we see political weakness, we see aristocratic greed really causing the downfall of the high-end court over time. So what you have is a Minamoto clan that rises to power. So about from the end of the 12th century until the late 16th century, power stays in the hands of those Minamoto family members. And what they do is they install a shogun, S-H-O-G-U-N, or a military ruler to reign supreme. So the shogun is separate from the emperor. The emperors during this period have virtually no power at all. They're really just kind of a figurehead. And the Minamoto shogun or shogunate were really trying to emphasize military power at the time. Because power became decentralized under the clan, noble families returned to battling over estates all the time. And in order to protect their lands, the nobles recruited samurai. The samurai are professional warriors. In return for their sacrifice, they receive clothing, shelter, food from their landlord. And in the absence of, there's no army, there's no central political force to stabilize the society. So the samurai really play a central role in this 400-year period after high-end Japan fell. So what I just kind of explained here with the shoguns and the samurai might be sounding familiar to you, and it should. This should sound like the feudal system that we see in Europe as well. So let me kind of explain the Japanese feudal system that they have. So for hundreds of years, Japan had a feudal society without a centralized government. So you have the landowning aristocrats, the daimyo, battling for supreme power over all the land. Most of the rest of the people work as rice farmers. So you have both European feudalism and Japanese feudalism. They both feature very little social mobility, as you can see in this chart. Both systems were built upon a hereditary hierarchy, so that means that, in Japan, peasants, which were known as serfs, they were born into their lives of economic dependence. Samurai were born into their role as protectors. Daimyo were born into lives of privilege. If you were to compare those three groups in Europe, those groups are serfs, knights, and nobles. But what distinguishes Japanese feudalism from that of Europe is that the daimyo really enjoyed a lot more power than the nobility in Europe did. The daimyo ruled over huge, vast stretches of land, and in reality, they were more powerful than either the emperor was or even the shogun. By contrast, when we look at Europe's hierarchy, they place the monarch above the nobility. So, though there were periods when authority of the monarch kind of, was lessened, power was distributed among the nobility, the main centralized power structure in Europe, feudalism, would not change really until we start to see the industrial era start. In Europe, the ideal knight held to the code of chivalry. These knights had duty to countrymen, duty to God, duty to women. The last of these duty to women was expressed through courtly love and the virtues of gentleness and graciousness. In Japan, that code was known as Bushido, and they stressed frugality, loyalty, martial arts, and honor until death as well. And here you can see those codes of Bushido. And here you can see some images of the samurai in their full attire. So kind of be thinking about what you know about knights' attire and what they look like. Here's another image, and you may be familiar with the samurai sword and the importance of the samurai sword. Here's another image of early mounted samurai warriors running into battle. Here's samurai that are charging as well. I'm going to put up a video that won't be played in this lecture, but I will post the video along with this up in Schoology so that you can watch it. It's about 5 minutes, and it talks about the samurai, and it talks about how they made their clothing. It wasn't true armor like we see the knights wear, and it's kind of interesting. So I'll post that up on Schoology as well. So here you can kind of see the medieval warriors and see the difference between the European knight versus the samurai warrior. We'll talk about this too, as far as like posing and how they fought and kind of what their code was as we progress even into World War I and World War II. So here's another image. So here you see some knight's armor versus samurai armor and just how different those look. And again, the video will talk to you in more depth about that. And finally, the last thing that we'll touch on here are the attempted Mongol invasions of Japan. So these Mongol invasions of Japan between 1274 and 1281 were major military efforts by Kublai Khan to conquer Japan. Ultimately, they were both a failure, and this was a huge deal because, as we will look at with the Mongols, their empire was just enormous, and there seemed to be no limits on how, who they could conquer and how big their empire could get. This was a limit on it, and so they were like, whoa, wait a minute, we weren't successful with this. There is a limit to what we can do. And so that was a big deal. It was also a major historical event for Japan as a nation as well, so that they were not conquered by the Mongols. That for them historically is a big deal. Interestingly enough, it's also one of the earliest times that we see the word kamikaze used. Kamikaze means divine wind. And it was used to, in reference to the 2 typhoons that occurred when the Mongols were trying to invade Japan, and ultimately those winds were what stopped them from being successful. So this is it for Japan, just kind of a brief snapshot. We'll be looking at Japan and Korea and Vietnam in a little bit more detail in class, but this will give you an idea as to feudal Japan, which we will then expand on when we talk about this region in the next time period. So I will put up that video too, so make sure you look for that next in Schoology so that you can watch the brief 5-minute video on Japan. Thanks, guys.